Welcome back. Hello, this is Gary Edward Gedall, psychologist, psychotherapist, and this is the second part of the final episode of the final chapter of Who is Meghan Markle, and the end of this series. As I have mentioned before, I plan to use this series as the basis of a book on Meghan. So if you're interested in reading the whole thing, plus a few more chapters which I will add, then keep your eyes on my Amazon authors page. Okay, so where were we? Oh yes. Is Meghan narcissistic? Now before I answer that directly, I want to slow things down just slightly, because this is where people often rush too quickly into conclusions. What I'm offering here is not a diagnosis. It is a psychological appreciation based on publicly available material, which is necessarily incomplete, selective, and sometimes contradictory. So what we are doing here is constructing a hypothesis, not establishing a clinical fact or diagnosis. Now, if I were to describe her personality structure, yes, I would say there are strong indications of narcissistic features, not as a moral judgment, but as a psychological description. These include a need for validation, difficulty accepting fault, sensitivity to criticism, and a tendency to react strongly when challenged. Beneath this, there is often insecurity, fear of failure, and a fragile self-image. But that is only one layer. If we take a step back and look at this developmentally, one possible hypothesis, and I stress again, hypothesis, is that we're looking at a childhood that combined strong investment from one parent with inconsistency from another. And psychologically, that combination can be very powerful and destructive. On the one hand, one develops a type of confidence. They are told that they can succeed. They are given opportunities. They are exposed to adult environments early. On the other hand, if there is inconsistency in attachment, particularly maternal attachment, they may also develop a heightened sensitivity to emotional security, validation, and relational stability. So what you end up with is something quite complex: outward expression of confidence, inward sensitivity, and fragility. And that combination often produces individuals who are both driven and reactive. Now, I'll just take a look and see what we understand about narcissistic personality structures. Narcissistic personality disorder is described as a mental health condition characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance, a deep need for excessive admiration, and a lack of empathy for others. Individuals with this pattern often struggle with relationships, tend to take advantage of others, and may be hypersensitive to criticism despite their confident outward appearance. The causes are complex, possibly genetic, definitely psychological, developmental, and linked to childhood experiences such as excessive or inconsistent attention from parents. This is often mentioned. At that point, excessive or inconsistent attention is particularly interesting in this concept, because psychologically, inconsistency is often more impactful than deprivation. If everything or something or someone is consistently absent, the child adapts in one way. Obviously, if everything is consistently present, the child adapts in another way. But when it becomes unpredictable, when it is sometimes there and sometimes not, the child becomes alert, sensitive, and often develops strategies to manage that insecurity. Now, when we read that behind a mask of confidence there may be insecurity, poor self-worth, and even loneliness, this is entirely consistent with that kind of development picture. Now, what is very important clinically is that many of these features are not necessarily pathological. They are adaptive strategies. These can be expressed as strong narrative control, emphasis on presentation, and focused management on how one is perceived. Very much as Meghan is. But these are not simply personality flaws. They are ways of maintaining psychological balance. In my book on coping strategies, I look at the different strategies that people put into place as children so as to cope with their environments. The more an environment is safe and predictable, the more balanced and flexible are the coping strategies. The more an environment is unsafe and unpredictable, the more extreme and rigid they will be. What is seen as psychopathology can also be expressed as extreme and rigid coping strategies. If your internal world feels uncertain, you stabilize your external world. The one way of doing that is through control, hence the big boss syndrome, as mentioned several times in other episodes. Now, there are also elements that could suggest borderline traits: emotional reactivity, sensitivity to perceived rejection, but overall I would lean more towards a narcissistic organization. And the reason for that is quite simple. Despite the reactivity, she appears capable of maintaining roles over time, sustaining relationships where they function, and operating within structured environments for a long period of time. This suggests we're not dealing with a pervasive instability across all domains. Although it's also possible to argue that a hot and cold reaction to people who displease her is very much a borderline trait, and a lack of attachment to an important parental figure, especially her mother, can also be the root of a borderline personality disorder. So the jury's a bit out on that for the moment. Let me know what you think about this and my other reflections on her and her parents. Now, what I also see, and this is something I find particularly interesting, is this constant movement between two positions or coping strategies: the powerful controller and the vulnerable victim, what I call the big boss and the abandoned child, which are, from my point of view, two sides of the same problem. When control is maintained, the dominant position prevails.
I control. I decide. I move forward.
But when control is threatened, or worse, neutralized, something else appears.
I have been wronged. I am the victim. I am helpless.
Now again, this is not necessarily a pathology. It's what we call a regulatory mechanism. It's a way of maintaining psychological equilibrium when the system is under stress. And in highly exposed individuals, particularly public figures, this kind of oscillation can become more visible because everything is amplified. Again, we can find here certain coping strategies that have become both rigid and extreme. However, this is not the whole picture. And it is very important not to reduce someone to one set of traits. She is intelligent. She is capable of learning. She has developed real skills. She has worked consistently. She has energy, drive, and the ability to persuade and influence others. These are not minor qualities, these are important strengths. She also has a strong capacity to construct and maintain a coherent narrative about herself, which is extremely valuable in public life. However, there also appears to be limitations. Firstly, her inability to acknowledge certain truths, certain realities. This can be very problematic. And another limitation may be a lack of a realistic awareness of her own boundaries and capabilities. A belief she can occupy multiple roles: teaching calligraphy and bookbinding, being an actress, being an entrepreneur, being a global figure, without fully recognizing the constraints of each. And as I've mentioned before, this is very similar to the model she's been given by her mother, who has also occupied multiple roles and identities over time: makeup artist, small business owner, travel agent, yoga instructor, jewelry making teacher, licensed clinical social worker after earning both a bachelor's degree and then a master of social work, and finally business executive as CEO, CFO and secretary of Loving Kindness Senior Care Management. Quite a lot, don't you think? Well, whether that is coincidence, influence or education is another question. But psychologically, models matter. We reproduce what we see. Now, at the same time, she demonstrates a strong ability to convince others of her value, her vision, her narrative. And that in itself is a form of talent. Not necessarily creative talent in the traditional sense, but relational and pervasive. Not necessarily creative talent in the traditional sense, but relational and pervasive talent. And that should not be underestimated. How else could you get a Netflix deal for millions and millions of dollars with what she's offering to give to them? So, what is my overall conclusion? She's not simply good, she's not simply bad, she is, in my view, a psychologically complex individual. Someone whose strategies have worked extremely well in certain areas of her life and less well in others. Someone who can be generous, capable and effective, and at the same time someone who can be reactive, defensive and emotionally limited in other situations. Like all human beings, she is a mixture, but in her case, that mixture is particularly intense. And perhaps that's what makes her so compelling. My role is not to criticize, my role is to reflect. And perhaps, if there's one thing to take from this, it's this: that psychological strategies that help us survive and succeed at one stage of life can become limiting at another, and that real growth often requires stepping back, slowing down, and allowing something more stable, more grounded, and more flexible on the relational level to emerge. Because ultimately, a meaningful life is not built on projection or perceived success, but on connection. So that's it. That's everything for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time with a psychological assessment of someone else. If you have any ideas of who I should look at next, a real person or even a fictional character, let me know in the comments and I'll take that into consideration. So take it easy. Until the next time, kindest, Gary.